participants are requested to involve into the discussion, to follow the discussion attentively, and we will start soon. I'm happy to welcome both the on and offline participants of today's event.
Recording in progress.
My name is Irina Chaika, and I am the member of the Legal Development Network civil society organization. This was the organization that has conducted the research that we are going to present today, and I will be the moderator of today's event. Please note that we have both on and offline participants and attendees. So please make sure that the discussion is friendly, which is why I kindly ask all the online participants to ask your questions using the chat box. If you feel the need to speak up, please raise your hand on Zoom. And the offline attendees, please raise your hand and I will give the floor to you. So we actually can start. Our today's presentation is going to be conducted or be consisting of several panels. We will start with a discussion of the content of the research, and I kindly ask Mr. Yevhen Poltenko, the CEO of the civil society organization, the Legal Development Network, to join the discussion. Roman Romanov, the program director of the program, the director of the program Human Rights and Justice, Vasil Andriev from the Trade Union of the Construction Professionals of Ukraine, and online we have the research assistant from New York University, the former member of the Argentinian office and justice expert Gustavo Maurino, and the expert Swati Mehta. They are also today with us. In fact, I also have plenty of interesting questions to ask. And first and foremost, I would like to ask Yevhen the following question. When did this research start? When this research started, did you have any expectations from this particular research? And do you have an idea what actually the informal employment in Ukraine is? So can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen. Our research team from the Legal Development Network is happy to welcome you all, both on and offline attendees. So as you can see, not all the panelists are here, so you can see empty chairs. So traffic jams in Kiev are preventing them to come on time. But we still have many attendees, both national and international, today with us. Before we start the discussion, before we start discussing the results of the research, I would like to pay your attention on the following idea. I would like to ask you to come back, to mentally come back to March 2020. I'm sure you remember that the government of Ukraine decided to introduce the quarantine because of the start of the pandemic. This quarantine is still ongoing. It may not be that severe as in March last year, but it is still ongoing. Please note that not all of us could feel the influence of the pandemic on our health. Well, as for me, I already had COVID and many of my relatives and friends did. And there were many victims of the pandemic. But from the very start of the pandemic, all of us could feel the economic consequences of COVID-19. Many enterprises, the small and medium enterprises in the first place, they could feel the influence of the pandemic, so that they were urged to stop or maybe to limit the scope of their activities. And this also impacted employees of these enterprises. And at least the member organizations of our network could feel that the issue of the labor rights and the violations of the labor rights, and especially issues concerning job losses or issues concerning dismissals or leave of absence, these were the top questions that we were asked from the start of the pandemic. And to give you an example, I can tell you the following. In 2019, there were only around 5% of people addressing our network, which concerned the labor rights. In 2020, these number multiplied, and we already had 10% of all people addressing us because of the labor rights issues. At the same time, these contacts raised a number of questions concerning the labor rights of persons unofficially employed, without official employment. But in fact, we face these people every day by watching construction works in a neighboring street, or using buses, marshrutkas, or buying coffee at the neighboring coffee shop, or ordering pizza in the evening. Actually, these people, the couriers or the construction workers or shop assistants, many of them are employed unofficially. But we were not aware of the scope of the problem. We did not know how many people are working without the official employment. Only when these people face certain issues at the working place, when their labor rights are being violated, they realize that they have no chance to protect their rights. And to be aware of this problem, to be aware of why this problem appears, and to be aware of the scope of this problem, how people face it, and whether these problems can be resolved. This was the questions that we asked ourselves, and we also wanted to suggest the ways to resolve this problem. So this is why we started this research. We are really thankful to the Renaissance Foundation for the support and for the opportunity to discuss the results of this research today. And to make a conclusion, I would like to say that the informal employment is a multidimensional social phenomenon which has different manifestations in this society, and this not only in Ukraine, but globally. And it does depend on the level of the economic development of the country. This is why we hope that this particular research helps us to understand the problem more deeply and to maybe have more chances to resolve this problem. But despite the global context of the problem, we are happy to have both key Ukrainian partners and the representatives of the global expert community. Thank you, Evgeny. Our panelists are on their way here, but our international experts are already online and with us. So if you need the interpretation, you need to choose the Ukrainian channel on Zoom. This helps you to hear the Ukrainian interpretation. So there is a Ukrainian channel, yeah. Well, I believe this will depend on the version of Zoom that you have. So you may not have the Ukrainian channel if you have an older version of Zoom. So as for the offline attendees, you can use the headset at the coffee break table or here on my side. So Hen, you touched upon the question of the pandemic, and you said that the pandemic actually changed the society dramatically. And globally, it is being said that the inequality is a very acute issue nowadays because of the pandemic. And under these circumstances, we conduct local research in particular communities, in particular countries. Well, this research was about the local context, but I have a question to our expert, Gustavo Maurino. Do local research works actually impact the development of the people-centered justice in global contexts?
Well, hello, good morning from Argentina. Good afternoon to you there. It is early in the morning in Argentina now. And it's a pleasure for me to share this conversation with you. And well, your question is really important in two aspects, I would say. From one side, digging into the evidence about the scope, the causes, the implications of these kinds of programs is critical, and it has to be a task conducted domestically, but also we need a global conversation about this problem, the informal employment or the shadow economy as you have described it. In many countries, the structural problems are really similar. I was reading the document, the report, and it was like reading about Argentina in terms of the sectors of the economy affected by this problem, the implications, the vulnerability that it creates in terms of deciding about your life, etc. So we face the same structural challenges and problems in terms of this issue all around the country. And as Yevgen said, even in low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries, the problem is there with different implications, of course. So it is key that we can share a global conversation about this, and that we take advantage of the evidence that we find at the domestic levels. I also found that the methodology of the report was really important and critical, because it is not just about reading the big numbers, the big data. It is about capturing the everyday experience of people facing these problems. And I found particularly valuable the approach of conducting surveys and focus group, because the people-centered approach, and I guess my colleague Swati would talk a little bit about that, the people-centered approach requires to start any conversation about what actually happens to the people, how people is experiencing these problems. And then you analyze the institutional dimensions and you start designing solutions. But you have to start with the people and the everyday experience of facing these problems and how these problems are related to some other problems. In the case of Argentina, and that will be my last comment, this particular problem of informal work has, for example, huge implications in terms of gender equality. Many employees, informal employees, when they get divorced, for example, it is really critical for women that in many cases have been taking care of domestic issues to really receive the kind of compensations and alimony for the children, because they cannot prove that their former husband or partner had a formal job or a formal income, etc., etc. So the implications of these problems for equality issues, for gender issues, for many other dimensions of everyday life are huge, and you have to address them by starting with the everyday people's experience. Unless you do that, you just keep your conversation about institutional reform, legal reforms that are of course important, but won't give us what we need in terms of transforming people's life. So that will be my first comment, and I'm happy to expand the conversation if you're interested. Thank you so much.
Дякуємо, Густаво.
Thank you, Gustavo. Well, as far as I understand, the global movement of the people-centered the global movement of the people-centered justice requires that the data that we gather give us the bigger picture, not only about the state of the particular country or particular city, particular community, but the global picture, so that we can discuss global approaches to people-centered justice. As Yevgen today said, we are facing a challenge, so we need to find a balance between the problems of the government, of the state, between the issues of the employers and the issues of the employees. And these problems must be balanced so that we do not face the inequality, the interest inequality. But does this balance, can this balance actually be in accord with the people-centered justice? And Swati, please, can you give us the example when the principles of the people-centered justice, when this balance allowed to improve the access to justice in certain countries? So Swati, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And congratulations, many congratulations to LDN and the International Renaissance Foundation for a very interesting piece of research, which I found very interesting to read. Unfortunately, I don't speak Ukrainian, so I just had a look at the executive summary, which was really, really interesting for me. As my colleague Gustavo just mentioned, right, when we are talking about people-centered justice, the key thing, what happens is many of us, whether we are lawyers or we are in the government or judiciary or civil society, we often believe that we know what the problems are that people are facing. And we think we know solutions, what is needed to solve these. But what is required by a people-centered approach is a paradigm shift in our thinking and the way we work on some of these issues. It is not merely about changing laws, changing policies, or having more judges or police officials. These are important. But what is more important is to really understand how men, women, children experience justice and injustice. And we need to draw on data. We need to draw on evidence to see what works to meet people's needs. And this requires a focus on data collection. And then using this data, using this evidence to formulate people-centered policies. So studies like the one LDN has just done are key to ensuring people-centered justice. The other point that you made in this question was about how different, I wouldn't call it balancing different, interest, but that is one way of putting it. But what requires for people-centered justice is once we understand what the problems are and we understand them from the people, we as different sectors need to come together to solve these problems. It cannot be just the lawyers or the judges or the Ministry of Justice doing this. It will have to be the Labor Department, it will have to be the employers, and most importantly, people who are affected by these problems. So we need to talk to all the stakeholders, and once we understand problems, try and resolve them. So the importance of working together and cross-sectorally is extremely important when we are talking about people-centered justice. And once we have done this, another key issue, idea is to support people in resolving their justice problems in the ways that best suit them. So think about different ways in which we can do it, whether using formal systems, informal systems, mediation. What is it that suits those people? So while, Yevgen, it's important to talk about global experiences, people-centered justice must be very context-specific, because what informal laborers in the informal and workers in the informal sector in Ukraine need might be different from what they need, say, in Bangladesh or in Argentina or in other parts of the world. So we need to be very context-specific. We need to understand the problems in that context and find solutions which suit them. And empowering people, that's the other key thing. We must, so as I mentioned, it's not us as stakeholders who are interested, who must design solutions, but these must be designed in consultation with those who are facing problems, and they must be empowered. People must be empowered to actually be able to seek justice, claim justice. I think another thing that I would focus on when talking about people-centered justice is on prevention strategies. So it's not only about resolving things when problem has already occurred, but we need, once we understand what are the injustices, how people face them, we must think about strategies for preventing these from occurring. And these are some of the key things which also impact. I think probably I should mention here that one of the key costs of injustice is in terms of weakened social contract. And we don't want that. Justice is a critical factor in the relation between state and the people. So we must, when people are unable to access basic services or they feel discriminated against, they lose faith in the state. So what we must do is ensure that we understand their grievances, we listen to them, we go where people are based, and we resolve and prevent disputes that are taking place by actually taking services closer to the people who need them most, by using technology, by using multiple sectors to de-escalate some of the grievances. I think some of the last point that I would make is that as justice sector, and when I say justice sector, I don't mean only police or judges or lawyers. It's justice sector in the broader sense. It will include ombudsmen, it will include government departments. We need to find ways to provide more gateway rights to people. So things like legal identity, land tenure, reducing harassment of informal sector businesses, and finding ways to regulate that sector fairly, tackling corruption. All of these can be fatal to social contract and will impact people's trust in the justice system. So when we are thinking and talking about people-centered justice, these are some of the things that we will need to take into account as we design some of our strategies. I think I've spoken a lot, and I hope not too fast for the translator. I speak too fast, but happy to take any questions or comments later. Thank you. And I look forward to the discussion on the study.
Дякуємо, Сваті. Ми точно ще повернемося з запитаннями.
Thank you, Swati. We will definitely come back to you with the questions. Because the presentation of the research. So what was really resonating in what you said is that in the condition of the pandemic, the world is facing the challenge of changing the social contract overall. So if we talk in our context, our community, Ukraine, we talk about a reform of sorts that was supposed to happen in terms of the legal relationships and labor relationships. But one of the specificities of our society is that we pretty often react to reforms pretty fast that are still only scheduled to happen. I can see that Vasil is here with us already. So my next question would go to him. And my question is, do we have understanding as of now about the challenges that the state faces, the employers face, the employees face in the context of overcoming lowering the level of the informal employment? Thank you very much for your question. Unfortunately, my internet is not fast enough to show my video to you, just not to lose the sound. So for us, in the fields of construction, in the tourist industry, in the trade industry, the informal employment is 50% to 2/3 of all of our workforce. So answering the question, we can see that the state can see the control measures and reform measures of employers. They see it as the only way to overcome the problem of the informal employment in the economy overall. Official statistics says that 5% is the number, that's the 5%, that's the number that informal employment went down overall in the country. So I'm not really ready to comment on the 5%, whether it's true or not, but I observe that the level of informal employment did indeed go down. And some of our employees did sign the official employment contract after the campaign started on the 1st of July. Another thing is that, of course, those are the minimum wage contracts, and the rest of the 2/3 of the 3/4 of the wages that they get, they still get in the envelope informally. Unfortunately, our employees and the members of our union have to agree to these conditions. Well, especially in Kiev, people might be surprising to you. In the capital of Kiev, the conditions of work are worse than in other bigger cities of Ukraine. So because there is just more people who are after those jobs and less choice. So the workers in our line of work, they have to sign those fictitious contracts just because they have no other opportunities. They have no other employment opportunities. Meanwhile, they might have already have rent contracts and might have gotten used to a certain standard of life. On the other hand, we can see that the employers overall are not looking at informal employment as a way out to solve the human resources crisis. Many of them say we need to find new people, we need to have some rotations within, we have to advertise more but the informal employment, no, it's too expensive, it doesn't pay for itself, and it makes it really hard to fire a person. The COVID issue, well, in our industry, I cannot say that there was any big impact because construction went on all months through the pandemic, probably with the exception of several first weeks when we were just figuring out what we are going to do in terms of the measures, to comply with the measures, the masks, the antiseptics, and what will be the new requirement. After that, we understood that there will be no pressure. We are not going to do anything, and just people will just catch it, have the natural immunity, and that's it. So there's no this desire to have all the employers formalized. We just hope that there will be change in the legislation, but actually nobody really asked the employers whether they're going to do something about it, whether they're happy with the change in the legislation. We think still it's going to happen. Well, if we think about all the taxes that they have to pay, well, when we see that the data, when the taxation was lowered, like we didn't see any change in the levels of the informal employment, unofficial employment. So I don't think if the state imposes some repressive measures, we don't think it's going to impact either. So probably, like for small business and for big business, it's a little bit different also. It depends on, like, because small businesses are much more vulnerable. Did it answer your question, please?
Дякуємо, пане Василю.
Thank you, Vasily. Actually, what we can see now is it looks like we are focusing, we're now getting the understanding of what our focus is going to be. We're talking about the necessity of having the social contract on the Ukrainian level to formalize the informal employment. And we also started talking that we need to listen to particular stakeholders and really take into account their everyday experience when we plan our activities, when we implement reforms. So we already started talking about the fact that we need to consolidate our efforts and balance between the interests of all of the stakeholders. Finally, I would also like to touch on a question, an issue. Well, keeping in mind that all of those processes that are there nowadays more or less based on the people-centered justice principles right now. And actually the example of the study that we conducted, well, we can see that many people, many events, the study, the development programs, etc., they are supported by the program of human rights development of the Renaissance Foundations. But we have somebody from the foundation, Olga Galchenko, and I have a questions to her. To what extent research like that one, like the one that was conducted, having to do with the employment sphere, to what extent they're important for establishing the people-centered justice in Ukraine? Thank you. Roman, my colleague, is trying to fight the Kyiv traffic, which becomes harder and harder with each day. So I still hope he makes it to be part of it after all. Like answering your question right now and supporting all the speakers that spoke before me, just like what Evgen mentioned, remembering the 2020, how it all began. And I really remember really well one of our first Zoom meetings. Many people were present, of those who are present now, the colleagues and partners, and we were just sharing our fears and our reactions and our prognosis about the pandemic. And it was that early that we raised the questions of the legal rights, labor rights, and about how quarantines and lockdowns can change our rights, of our perception of labor rights and their implementation. And now we are in the second year after this really life-turning conversation. So we are trying to look back and understand whether our prognoses are coming true. Are there any changes? Is there anything happening that can be a threat, or maybe vice versa, an opportunity in terms of labor rights? So we decided not to make guesses, but actually study these issues and conduct several researches that would help us understand what exactly is going on in the sphere of labor rights in Ukraine, how what was the impact of the pandemic and what our next steps would be. So the Helsinki Human Rights Union actually conducted another research which was more focusing on the trade unions, what changed it for them, what is their place in the future. And then there was the this current study conducted by the LDN, which was devoted to the subject of informal employment. What can I say? We can say that our prognosis are really coming true, that paradigm is indeed changing. On one side, we can see more and more problems appearing that has to do with the pandemic, but we also have good news. Well, we see that we see this new interest in the subject of labor rights. We hear more and more people talking about this subject, because the impression was that in the previous years, well, of course, there were some labor rights. People were working on it. Somebody was defending other people's labor rights. But now we have the impression that now this topic is becoming mainstream finally. So we see posts on social networks, it's on TV. So we kind of going away like from this mentality of like, you have the job, you get the money, just don't rock the boat. It's like, and don't think about whether you get your salary in the small white envelope, whether it's official or how. Don't really think about like the employer, the way the employer treats me. Should I ask for more? So now we see the discussions starting, which is actually in line with a general tendency in Ukraine. People starting asking themselves questions whether my rights are being violated. How can I protect? How can I defend my rights in general? In my opinion, I see new opportunities arising for people who are interested in defending their labor rights and developing and increasing their labor rights. Would unite in a sort of pool of stakeholders, and we could go all together, and also including people who defend and research this subject and assist. So basically, this whole circle of ours, we're all present here. So we started to thinking whether we should have like one joint agenda regarding labor rights in Ukraine, and have a look at like to what extent this agenda would be in line with the international agenda. We heard some international experts. I think we can be quite confident we are pretty much on the same page in terms of defending the rights and like basically coming back to this people-centered worldview in terms of rights and defending the rights. So I think that research like that could be a good foundation for future joint agenda, future action in the future. So thank you, Olga. It looks like we are making first steps to like achieve the people-centered justice. Ola, I invite you to the hall, and now we will switch to discussing the particular research. Actually, we'll move step by step through it, and we will start with like presentation of the research, what it was, what was the methodology was, and finally Olga started talking about focusing.
We're going to speak about the key recommendations and how they can be used in the nearest future. I suggest to make a broader circle of the panelists, and I invite Alexander Щербатюк a sociologist, an expert who was the coordinator of the sociological group of our research team. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Irina, for introducing me. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving me a chance to be part of this really critical and really interesting project. As far as I can tell, we were successful enough in our efforts, even despite many challenges that we faced. Everything worked out, and I'm happy to present the results, which are extremely interesting. When we were planning our research, we tried to achieve certain research results. So the following slide, please. Well, there is no slide representing the research task, unfortunately, but first and foremost, we were trying to understand what is actually the informal employment and how it can be defined according to the legislation. Force. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for showing the appropriate slide. Well, we tried to understand the characteristics and the key factors of the informal employment. We tried to define the attitudes towards this phenomenon amongst the officially employed people, and what are the legal problems on informally employed people, and what were the problems caused by COVID-19. Well, let's come back to the previous slide, please. As long as our focus group, our target group was rather specific, we decided to combine the quantitative and the qualitative data gathering method. I would actually suggest that we divide our research in three parts. The first part was the tabletop part, when we analyzed the existing stats in this particular issue. Then, using the results of the tabletop research, we developed the instruments for focus group research and in-depth interviews. As you can see, we had 50 respondents, and we had 15 deep interviews with the stakeholders. So I will come to this issue later on. At the third stage, basing on the previous results, we developed the instruments to conduct quantitative interviews and quantitative research, and develop the instruments for the interviews. Well, let's go on. Let's move on. I already mentioned the target audience was rather specific. So we only said that people facing certain legal issues were the informally employed people. So, and why was this target audience specific? First of all, there was no reliable statistics in place about the scope of these people. Secondly, the group of informally employed people is rather closed. Despite this issue, this phenomenon is widespread, but it is not really legal. So people are not really willing to get involved in research of all kinds, and they are not really open. And when we were planning for the focus groups and the quantitative survey, we realized that people will be reluctant to give us answers. We were supposed to face low dynamics and maybe the reluctance to answer some questions. And as for the in-depth interviews, the situation was the following. So as you can see, different experts were involved, in particular from governmental sector. And these experts, they were really willing to share their practices and their experiences they gathered with informal employment in Ukraine. And here I would like to pay the attention at the professionalism of the whole research team, of the team members, both recruiters and the moderators, and all the team members who kept going even despite all the challenges and all the people reluctant of speaking up. They were able to gather the data and to gather high quality data, reliable data after all. And as you can see, additionally to the main group of the informally employed people, we also had a control group. These were people officially employed. So why did we do so? As long as our research is not really representative for the unofficially employed, it was important to have this control group to be able to compare results, the problems of the officially and unofficially employed people. And basically, I would like to mention that our research is not representative for the informally employed people, but even though there are some factors, so the lack of reliable statistics, as I already mentioned, in terms of informally employed people, and the limits due to the method of that data gathering. So we used telephone interviews. We just used the random peoples. But as for the online interviews, we use the online panel, and there is a limitation to this method because people actively using the internet, they had bigger chances to get involved into this research. This is the case when people from rural areas or people without certain level of education, they had lower chances to be part of this research. And despite the wide scope of this research, I believe some aspects are still not researched. For example, the role of the employer or the role of the judiciary in the sphere of the informal employment. And as for me, the instruments of the research can be adopted and they can be used within other projects, and the results that we have achieved then give impulses to further research and further activities. I believe this was basically it in a nutshell, but we are not letting you go yet. As far as we have understood, one of the results or one of the goals was to try to formulate a methodology that could be later on adopted to the rest of the elements of the informal employment, so that we can gather or see the bigger picture of the informal employment in Ukraine. But we already have a question from the audience. Let me remind you that you can use the chance to ask your questions in the chat box, and we will read them aloud. So one of the question is as follows. So this is a question about your teamwork. You mentioned that the team was professional and they could overcome the closed nature of the target audience. But how did you prepare your team? Was this the classical way to get your team prepared, or did you use any innovative approaches? You can can share with us, with other researchers maybe? Irina, thank you very much, and thanks to the audience for this question. Well, me as an outsider, I don't know how the network actually approaches the research usually, but I believe you have good way to prepare the interviewers, and we used a number of trainings for the recruiters, for the interviewers and moderators, for the interviewers that were supposed to talk to people on the phone. And what I can tell you, these trainings, they were not only technical and theoretical, they were as well full of motivational things, which I believe are really important, especially for the research activities aimed at complicated target audience. We also maintained communication in Telegram chats and in different chats and so on, so that the team members are not forced to face their challenges on their own. I believe this was also one of the success factors. Yes, we also have some questions left, but unfortunately we're limited in time. I believe that after this event is over, we will figure out how we can get the answers on the questions that we could not ask during the event. Yeah, we have a question as for the work with the respondents. So what was the way to identify your respondents? What were the criteria for people to get into your research activities? As for the focus groups, we use the combination of different methods. Firstly, these were the respondents who addressed the network for legal aid. And we also had databases. We had certain criteria numbers to search for the needed respondents as well. As for the criteria, we included both quantitative and qualitative instruments to involve people who faced legal problems at their working place. And as you can see, we have a list of informally employed people of different categories we involved in our research. As for the focus group, we had one group discussion with every respondent type. As for the quantitative survey, we didn't have certain criteria as for the groups, but we involved only people with experience of legal problems. And I would allow myself another question. What are the advantages to involve the control group into the research? As I already mentioned, the control group was crucial because we don't have the reliable data to choose the informally employed people, and due to this control group, we could make concrete decisions and come to concrete conclusions, develop recommendations. Well, I will not ask you any more questions, so let us agree that we will continue the discussion online. Thank you very much, Alexander. You can return to your place in the hall. And let us come to the most intriguing part of our today's presentation. Yevgen, what were the key results after the research? So what could you discover after you processed all the data? Well, I'm really surprised that people ask so many questions about the methodology. Well, we already mentioned the specificity of the methodology, especially the involvement of the control group. which allowed us to compare the situation of officially employed people and unofficially employed people, so that we could overcome the lack of reliable data. And Vasil already mentioned, my colleague already mentioned from the construction trade union, that nobody knows for sure how many workers are working informally. It is either 1/3 or half. But as for the results of our discussion, so let us start with a portrait of the typical officially employed people or person. So if we were to describe this person, if we compare the main groups, so the informally employed and formally employed people, we can see that in certain economic branches where people work informally, so these branches are construction and renovation, this is the industry, this is the household services, and hotel and restaurants. If we compare the situation with the officially employed persons, we can see that the informally employed people are usually involved into the household assistance, so these are 5%. And if we speak of sectors as medicine, pharmacy, education and science, security, and here we have a bigger number, a bigger share of officially, formally employed people, so we can rarely see any informally employed people in these sectors. The informal employment is usually typical for the SMEs and not frequently seen in big businesses and in governmental communal sectors. It is also worth mentioning, speaking of the scope of the employment, we were also astonished to find out that there are many informally employed people working full-time, 60%. Speaking of the part-time employment, this format is more typical for the informally employed people. So if we take the officially employed people, it is only 6% who are working part-time, and many people working in or employed informally are combining several positions, and it is a typical situation for students, for the elderly, and for women on maternity leave. And speaking of the self-employment, we have equal numbers for both formally and informally employed people, for both groups. Next slide, please. Here we can see the following aspects of the portrait of the informally employed people. Unlikely the data we had at the first stage of the research during the tabletop research activities. So most of the data we had showed that these were mostly men who are working unofficially, but we found out that these are mainly women who are employed informally, women of the age from 18 to 45 years. The informally employed people happen to have a lower level of education compared to the control group. And please remember that the informally employed people have a lower monthly income So the households of these people have lower income. Well, people are not really willing to answer the question, what is your monthly income? But we could raise this question and could get the answer. So we have the idea how big the household, these households really earn monthly. And we confirmed our ideas, our previous ideas, that the informal employment is more typical for vulnerable categories.
As you can see, the vulnerable people in those categories is not really overwhelming as compared to the whole number of all people that we surveyed. Informal employment in general, overall lasts for shorter time. Well, the experience of informal employment is in general is 4 years, as opposed to formal employment 9.5 years. 20% of people that we surveyed said that their experience with informal employment was less than 6 months. So we can see that there is a high turnover in that sphere. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see the main motivational factors that push people on the road of informal employment. The main factor is the higher wages because of the avoidance of taxes, and of course the flexible work schedule. Coming back to our portrait, the typical typical and uninformally employed person. So higher wages is of course important, but at the same time we can say that overall the general income is much lower than for the households where all adult members are officially employed. Another factors were like the convenient frequency of payment, like by hour, by week, or whatever is available. Opportunity to switch jobs fast. What's interesting, really, many people mentioned the opportunity to work for distance work because through the informal employment. An interesting finding was that the 3/4 of informally employed people were mentioning that they are trying to look for official employment or to get legalized somehow, to legalize their activities if they are self-employed. When we asked them about the main barriers, what's in the way of doing that, to legalize, they were mentioning mainly the lack of desire, lack of capability of the employers to go ahead with this. As Alexander already mentioned, the research allowed us to study, well, partially study and partially find the answers to this situation, but still we can see the necessity for additional research from the point of view of informal employment, from the point of view of employers, their needs and the barriers that they face when they fail to meet this request to formalize their employees. We also asked our respondents about the possible strategies that they see in terms of solving this problem of informal employment. What was interesting is that from the options that we received as answers, the more popular were creating a very simple, user-friendly ways to legalize on short, seasonal, or irregular works, and simplifying the taxation. Other what was mentioned was informing the population about like why informal employment is harmful for the state. Now, coming back to the informational campaign that the state bodies are now trying to promote in the society in order to change that. Next slide, please. Coming back to the legal problems of informal laborers, we can definitively say that where we have some comparisons with the control group of the official employed people. So we can see that informal employed people face those issues much more often. Many of the issues are refusal to provide the sick leave and sick pay, refusal to provide paid vacations, paid leaves, denial of official employment, only partial payment of vacation money or like leave pay or maternity leave pay. I have to say that almost 50% of our respondents were in the process of trying to solve the issues that they faced, both for informally and formally employed people. Unfortunately, only in 3 cases out of 10, people said that they were successful, both with formally and informally employees. So basically, their success percentage is pretty much the same. So we think that this brings us to a conclusion that the official mechanisms of solving the legal issues are not efficient. They don't really work with both types of employment. We talk about the main reason. Well, people are not even trying to start solving their issues. In most cases, the reason is the lack of faith. People don't believe that you can achieve justice through doing something. Next slide. About the consequences of the legal problems. Again, just as like with the previous slide, the essence of the problems. When we look at the consequences, we can see that they are much harsher than for the informally employed people. Informally employed people, they have more stress, financial losses, health losses, loss of job, actually, harm to family relations. We talk about job loss and its consequences. An interesting conclusion that we see that based on the results of this survey, if we talk about the attempt to defend a person's labor rights, if we talk about the informally employed people, it's 6.5 times more often that they are fired as opposed to officially employed person when they try to defend their rights. Next slide, please. No, maybe not. Come back. Let's come back. If we talk about the cases when the legal problems are solved, after all, the ones that we just mentioned, in the majority of cases, 84% of cases, when this happens for informally employed people, informally employed persons, those problems are solved in an informal way. Mainly it's through the verbal contract with a verbal agreement with the employer. Again, if you compare it to the official employed people, it's much lower. It's 64%. So 1/3 of formally employed persons, they had an official, they had a chance of officially document their legal problems and resolutions of the conflict, as opposed to only 11% of informally employed persons. About going to court, with this. We only have single mentions and single cases, so hardly ever happens. In general, we have to say that in the survey, people who were surveyed, they have very little knowledge about where they should go for help and assistance in case of those problems. So if something like that happens, people try to find lawyers, legal professionals within the circle of their friends, or state bodies, state consultations. So again, which brings us to conclusion that we need to really multiply our efforts in terms of legal education. And coming back to the impact of the COVID-19, they're pretty obvious. Obvious and not so obvious at the same time. Obvious ones are we pretty much mentioned them. So the salaries were reduced, the jobs were reduced, and it all happened with the background of the general background of lessened opportunities to ask for legal protection and legal consultations. Also, we also observed lack of social guarantees and sick leaves, safe working conditions. Many people mentioned that it was impossible to work from distance in their jobs. There were also additional problems for parents because they had to oversee their children because their children were quarantined too, and they didn't go to schools or preschool physically. And a very interesting thing that we also found out that certain employers, they deny employment because without vaccination. So we also have also vaccination equality problem again, and how it's tied to that. Now, also we have to say that because of the impact of the pandemic, we can say that 60 cases of non-motivated layoffs, or people were sent, just asked to go on a non-paid leave temporarily. Some people were switched to the minimum wages. Many experts also say it was all caused by the pandemic. These are the results of our solution. We will be happy to switch to discussing them. Well, I have quite a range of questions now, but I still cannot avoid touching the question of the legal education and awareness raising and population. You mentioned that we have to double the efforts or triple the efforts. I just remember talking to a friend, why don't you get legalized? Why don't you become the individual entrepreneur? Oh, she was saying, oh, it's like figuring out how to do it, such a pain in the butt. Also, I have to actually stay in line in the taxation department. I'll actually spend this time working and earning money. Maybe I'll figure it out later. Oh, figuring out later is something we're going to discuss in the recommendation sections. But the questions that we received are as follows. Did you analyze, as part of this research, the competencies that are now in popular demand in the market? Maybe the list of the market demand, job market demand has changed somehow with the pandemic. Thank you for the question. It's a really interesting question. But actually, it wasn't really part of the topic of our research. We didn't really do any evaluation of the job market. We were focusing more on the actual situation and the target group, the people who work informally, and issues that might have influenced their rights, their labor rights. One thing that I can say in terms of the competencies, one of the questions in our research methodology had to do with the question was, did having some proof of your competencies, like diplomas or any other certificates, did it influence somehow, or maybe lack thereof? Does it really keep you from getting officially employed? So from the data that we received, you cannot really say that it's any correlation. Many people say that lack of a diploma or a certificate, they don't really mention that very often. It's a factor. I will ask our technical support come back to the slide why people are choosing the informal employment. The reasons, yeah, that one. No, the next one. Did you calculate the percentage of, you have the list of the reasons, do you have any numbers for the reasons? Like how often was this or that reason mentioned? In terms of in terms of how often in generally when people are choosing this or that factor or reason. Unfortunately, I don't have the exact numbers on me right now, but let me try to dig in a little bit. Let me open the paper itself. So if we talk about higher wages factor, it's important for 37% of people. So if we try to do the math right now, well, I can actually mention several more. Let me just list the most priority, the top 6. So the top 6 motivational factors. So the higher wages, 37. Work schedule, 33%. Third, employer doesn't want to employ officially, 28%. Number 4, convenient frequency of payment, 25%. Opportunity to choose and change jobs, number 5, 22%. Number 6 is distance working opportunities, 14%. Thank you, Yevgen. And the rest of the questions, I guess we'll leave it for our distance communications with those who will be interested because of our time limits. Now, we knowing about methodology and knowing about the key results, we can talk about recommendations that were formed as a result of the research. And who's going to help us is Vitaly Okrimenko, the project manager of the Legal Development Network. And I also would like to invite Olena Konovalova, the Deputy Director of the Department of Labor and the State Labor Services of Ukraine. And also Georgi Sandul, the head of the Labor Initiatives NGO, Maxim Serbatyuk, Program Director of the Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, Anna Pugacheva, the leading expert of Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine, and Alexei Dobronravov, the head of the expert group Directorate of IT Industry Development in the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine. And also, I would like to invite Gustavo Maurino and Swati Mehta to also be part in this panel discussion. We're going to work in several blocks. First of all, we'll talk about the recommendations that have to do with the formulating of the policies in the sphere of the labor relations. And after that, we will touch a little bit on further implementations. So Vitaly, the first, I give the mic to you first. What were the recommendations that you formulated? Hello, everybody. The people-centered justice is when we ask people what exactly do they want, and a certain expert circle gets together and tries to, using their expertise and their experience and the data,
which was today already mentioned frequently enough by Yevhen. So let's actually consider the policy making. And interestingly, some of the speakers already mentioned the issue of the social contract, which is an interesting question in the context of the structural changes like informal employment, shadow economy. And in this particular context, considering and working on the report, we try to communicate a lot with the different partners and stakeholders to show the conclusions that we arrived at, the data we discovered, to be able to negotiate things, to establish dialogue. These conclusions, they are not yet a roadmap. I believe a roadmap is when the key stakeholders already figured out where to go. I believe a research has to be an impulse, a motivation for a list of recommendations. And bearing that in mind, we've been thinking that we need an interdisciplinary team, like a team for this particular research, involving different partners at different stages. So we would want to suggest recommendations that would be a basis for further discussion. And this panel discussion is a chance to start the dialogue. So a dialogue about the new kinds of social contracts within the context of people-centered justice. So we tried to group our recommendations the following way. So we would suggest to reflect on that later on. And first block of the recommendations concerns the government policy making. And as for us, we believe it is a high time to start a broad public discussion about the improvement of the government policy in the sphere of labor relations, basing on the people-centered approach. So what I'm talking about, we need to concentrate on the laborers' rights when we think about the policy making and the changes of the policy. So we shall not forget that the number of unofficially employed is great. So we need to figure out what should be the mechanisms to protect the unofficially employed. And we shall as well bear in mind that the informally employed shall not give up. And the official statistics do not pay attention at these people, but this does not mean that these people do not exist. So we need to bear that in mind. So the first recommendation is to start a discussion and not forget about the informally employed. The other issue is the policy making based on the understanding of a problem and data. I would also say we shall have a deep understanding of this problem. I liked the previous speaker mentioning the true experience of normal people that we need to take into consideration. But it is really important to remember that we as well need to remember the problems of the employers, because without a comprehensive approach, we will not be able to overcome structural issues. And previous speakers already mentioned among the results of the research that people would really want to move towards formal employment. But the most important challenge is that the employer is not able to ensure this shift, to make it possible. And even at early stages, we had to face the fact that we need to ask the employers as well, using the same methodology, especially the employers from the small and medium-sized enterprises. We need to ask them, and we need to ask them what should be the incentives for them moving them to formal employment format. Well, and the second recommendation here states, if you want to know what people want, you just need to go and ask the people. This is an easy and a difficult recommendation at the same time. So how should you be asking people what they want? And here we would like to suggest involving the citizens into the decision-making, creating discussion platforms on different stages, on the employees level, on the employers levels, research activities with similar methodologies. These research activities cannot be representative if we mentioned the informal employment, but they really help making policies. And finally, improving the data gathering and the right way to use the gathered data. These are things that we frequently forget. And if we speak of the national context, local context, we need to build capacity of the institutions to analyze the data that helps us understand the real problems that people face. Next, what is key to the establishment of the new social contract? We need to understand what is actually the problem that we are facing. And in this particular case, it is important, if you read the report, if you read all the 100 pages of the report, you will see that many paragraphs of this report are devoted to the notion of the informal employment. If you ask several people what is the informal employment about, people will give you different notions. And even different governmental institutions use different approaches to the definition. So someone is led by the notion of shade economy or informal economy. So we need to find out what is the definition of this phenomenon. Well, to be able to understand the problem, we need to come up with a single universal definition of the informal employment. So this is where we have this first problem. Then the practice of regular national surveys is really key. It allows us both to monitor the situation and to make prompt decisions. But here we would like to draw your attention to the following thing. You don't have to forget the informally employed. You cannot easily reach these people. And we cannot allow us, if we want to make a strategy of overcoming the consequences of an official employment, we cannot allow ignoring the informally employed. And it is again important to speak about the employers. We need to have an attitude to the employers as to the people who create new jobs, and they are the driving force of the economy. So we were speaking about the incentives for the to move towards the unofficial employment? Well, in this particular case, we need to again think about the employers to make it possible for them. And again, the shift of the labor market. There was an issue, well, a question in the chat box addressing this issue. So our research team, we were also interested to find out. Well, we studied 50%, a half of what is needed. So we studied the employees, but the other half, the employers, and the ones to create jobs. This is again a new challenge. And without the data concerning the employers, it is not realistic to come up with a roadmap, which is again very important. And the administrative statistics, improvement of these statistics is the next recommendation. We believe it would be really great if the State Statistics Service of Ukraine pay attention at their methodology and the definition of the unofficial employment they use. If they figure out how they can get data about these citizens, about the informally employed, and about the people we frequently forget about. The next slide concerns the improvement of the legislation. So we cannot but mention the legislation here. So we recommend for simplification of official employment procedure. What we mean by that? First of all, the smaller scope of work. If you need to make super huge effort to get officially employed, it just makes no sense for the people. It just makes no sense for anyone. And here I also mean the gigs, so the irregular jobs. They also need to be simplified as for the official side of the employment. Then, introduction of the flexible working schedules. People keep saying it is important for them, especially at the age of the pandemic. Many people experience the flexible working schedules, and they have different attitudes to flexible working schedules. And this is already something that people want to have. And it is important that the legislator enables people working flexibly. And again, we are speaking from the standpoint of the people-centered justice. And it is a good example of how we are supposed to think about the improvement of the legislative procedures. It is important to ensure the adaptation to remote work formats, especially in the context of the pandemic. And it is important to support the employment. If we speak about the systematic policy, in terms of the informal employment, it is important to introduce temporary measures for the application of tax benefit. We cannot speak about quantitative data, but what people mentioned as for their employers, we did not ask the employers per se, but we asked people why they could not get officially employed. They like reflected on what their employers would say, how the employers would answer the question why it was not important to get the employees officially employed. People mentioned the tax burden, so we need to introduce the tax benefits. And last but not least, a balanced approach to policymaking with the consideration of the today's risks, and we need to concentrate on both problems of the employees and employers from the formal and from the informal sector. Next slide, please. We need to consider the barriers for formal employment and how to overcome them. So please note, it is worthwhile using the information about the real needs and problems of the employers to be able to identify the top 2, top 3 barriers that are most crucial. So I don't speak globally for Ukraine, but I speak about top 2, 3 barriers for a certain branch, for a certain territory. So these barriers may be similar, but they may as well differ. We need to think about local context to be able to overcome all the barriers. Well, we have 100 pages in the report, so I have plenty of things to say. I believe that the time is limited, but let me keep explaining. If we speak about people-centered approach, it is important to focus on the most important problem. It is not possible to use universal instruments. We have different cases of informal employment. So the approaches to overcome this issue may also differ. Thank you, Vitaly. Well, we have a free place now, and pre-seat here. I'm happy to introduce Roman Romanov, who joined us. We've been waiting for you, and we are happy that you were able to overcome the barrier of the Kiev traffic, and you were able to join us finally. Well, coming back to what we have just heard. So we had a comment. We shall bear in mind the rights of the employers and be able to safeguard them from certain legislative changes, which is sometimes the reason for informal employment. So I would like to address my question to Swati and Gustavo. And so one of the questions that I have will be addressed to Roman Romanov. Well, let me start with a more global question. Swati, Gustavo, we heard just now about the connection between the recommendations about the people-centered justice. Are there any recommendations to introduce the people-centered approach for the policymaking, for effective policymaking?
Або Густаво, або Сваті, хто зараз...
So it's up to you, Gustavo or Swati, who is ready to comment, please. It's up to you to decide.
Such a difficult question. Swati, you want to come first?
Happy for you to go first. I mean, you were a policymaker, but can add if there's something needed.
Okay. Well, I mean, the challenges are huge and different, as you all mentioned before. This is a systemic problem, so you have to address it in a systemic way, of course. And taking the people-centered approach at the heart of the strategy is key for having a good place to start with. But there is not one solution for every problem or one aspect that would open up all the solutions. So when you consider the people-centered approach and the idea of starting with the basic issue is how to protect people's rights or experience, etc. As you mentioned, or the report mentioned, from people's perspective, there is a lack of trust in the system and that is a general trend, global trend. There is a lack of trust in the system as a way to handle or to deal with the legal problems related to informal work, etc. The numbers are very clear that a huge amount of people actually try to use informal ways to solve their legal problems related to the work conditions, etc. So in terms of trying to support and to empower people to handle these problems, you need to develop comprehensive service strategies for reaching out to people, being close to people's needs, and being able to really create a path of trust in order to start handling their legal problems related to these issues. So in terms of how to start working with the affected people, you have to solve the trust gap. And that is, and the way to do that is to provide close community legal services to be present in the communities with the affected populations and start a conversation, a relationship that would allow them to really express their fears, their needs, etc. So unless we provide community services to build this trust, in terms of the people attitudes, nothing will happen. And as we mentioned before, you can try institutional legal reforms, etc., but at the end of the day, you need the people to really take the law and the rights on their own hands and start using them. So you need to be close to the people to provide community services to really create a trust environment for these issues to come to light. That would be my first comment on that. And the other thing is that in terms of achieving structural
З точки зору досягнення структурного підходу.
Oh, sorry, I had a problem.
It's okay, go ahead.
Okay. No, the other thing, just a quick comment, is that if we are trying to address structural systemic change, you have to create also a multi-stakeholders initiative. Everybody needs to be involved and to share the goal and the communication on how to really advance the agenda. It is not possible to succeed in structural systemic change just by working alone and with one kind of initiative. Civil society, government, trade unions, small businesses, etc. The challenge is to create a dialogue as the one we are having here, I guess, but it is a multi-stakeholder and long-term agenda. And unless we start working with that kind of approach, we are just throwing stones, but no really systemic change will happen. So those will be my two comments, I would say.
Дякуємо, Густаво. Чи є
If I can just
Thank you, Gustavo.
Can I just add a bit to that? I completely agree with Gustavo, and exactly. So what we need to do is to, in terms of ensuring that policy making is also people-centered, we need to be going closer, taking justice services closer to the people who need them most. Perhaps where possible, to use technology to resolve disputes so that we can, reach out to more people. There are other ways, using mediation, using volunteers, definitely working together, getting all the multiple stakeholders together to stop and prevent disputes from escalating. I think one more thing that I would add is to actually, invest in people-centered data collection and reach out to people who have been traditionally neglected or excluded. I specifically don't know much about Ukraine and whether, lack of legal identity, statelessness, migration is a huge issue. But in many, many contexts that I have worked, there are people who don't have legal identity, and therefore they're not able to participate in formal economy. I come from Myanmar, where many, many people were stateless. And then they would face other problems to access any kinds of right. And for governments to always remember that there are huge costs involved in if there is this kind of injustice going on, if more and more people are stateless, if they are unable to participate in economy, then what is the cost, not only to them, but also to the government? So I think Gustavo, in one of his comments, mentioned that an analysis of what is the cost of injustice becomes very important. A report that Task Force on Justice did, called Justice for All, which was not focused on labor rights, but it estimated that it costs governments between 0.5% to 3% of their GDP because of everyday justice problems that people face. So those are some of the things that policymakers need to keep in mind and therefore invest in taking a people-centered approach. Thank you.
Дякуємо. Отже, як ми бачимо, для формування якісно ефективної політики важливо.
So as we see, to form good quality policies, what's important is to keep to the principles of the people-centered justice. But Roman, I would like to ask you, in what extent for good policies, the research like we present today are important? Thank you for the question. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm only joining you a little bit later than it was originally planned. My feeling is that this research part is hugely underestimated, not only when forming the state policies, but even when you CSIs are trying to define their priorities. We have this preconception that people are suffering, we need to protect them, but it is really important to have a look at what people really want and create this portrait and to see how it looks in the systemic interconnections. There's the real intentions of people that we are trying to protect. What do they look like? I think it's crucial. If you look from the point of view of a person, then the picture might be a little bit different. At least it's like adds to the agenda something completely different. It looks like we have quite a lot of people who are not just want to be defended. It's their conscious choice to be informally employed, or whatever terminology we use. People feel that they are more free that way pretty often. If we see if we look at the reasons why is that so, we can see that actually to build a career here in our society, in any state organization or other organization, because there are no established practices in the institutions, or very few of them. Like there are no systems of like appointment of management, top management, of the fairness systems in the institutions. And we have lots of questions with them. So basically investing in somebody's career, in your own career, the time and the resources, keeping in mind all of those limitations that we have. People are very often not interested in that, in the long-term careers. So, which actually brings us to the question of the state of our institutions, including the organization of internal procedures. Secondly, of course, people need to have some sort of guidance, some sort of systemic factors that would actually motivate them to look more long-term. Well, if you look at our pension legislation, it doesn't look like it's just legislation. It looks just like additional taxation. Basically, a parliament can make one decision and whatever you invested in your pension can change in a minute, and you cannot really predict that. So in these conditions, people are trying to minimize their taxation, and they often choose that over investing into future resources that might or might not, in case they lose their employability, they would theoretically make sure that they stay at a certain level of life that they're envisaging in some future. Of course, people don't really have where to go with their complaints, because they're bound to be complaints in any legal relations. They're bound to be disputes. And on this level, what's really important is to have the union of employees, the trade union. It's really a good bonus, a good benefit that exists. On the other hand, if we look at the forms of employment that we are talking about today, well, actually, there is nothing that prevents people of this kind of employment from creating a union to defend their rights. If we go into research a little bit deeper and looking at this particular person and their situation, trying to look at their perspective very particularly from the point of view of their own personal rights and interests, we can see a very interesting and complicated agenda for something to think about, not only for state policy makers, but also for others who have something to do with employment, trade unions, and legal rights defense organizations, activists. And of course, we also hope that people will grow in terms of like their interest in being part of policy making will grow. So I'm very happy, and I would like to congratulate us all on this approach that we are trying to go down and deeper on the one particular person level, and like really raise this issue of people-centered approach. But of course, with each policy, people-centered now, we have to implement it, and I know that it's going to be a big challenge based on what we have seen during conducting this study. But very quickly, and very laconically, what would be the recommendations that we have found during the if you could launch my presentation, please. Next block is the implementation of the policies, and the next blocks will be put up for the discussion. First of all, it's the development of the partnerships and communications. No policy can be implemented really if this first challenge is not overcome. What's needed for that? Like involvement of all parts that we have discussed: the state, the employees, the employees, and the trade unions. But we also need to remember that there is specifics to those relationships between the employee-employer relations. Employers always have more opportunities and resources to prove themselves right. That's where the government, the state, has to come in and balance this issue. And the trade unions, of course, are crucial. The next thing is what's important is the cooperation with government and non-government legal services providers. Why? Because we think that they are underrated, because the demand for legal services is high, as we can see from the research, but in real practice, people using legal specialists and going to court to defend their rights, it's like minimum. That's why we need to start thinking about how we use the capacities that we have in the state, like the legal defense sector that is quite powerful, state and non-state. How can we make it work better with other stakeholders and also communicate with them? Also strengthening the roles of trade unions, in particular in the context of being a safeguard against job loss for people who are informally employed. I also want to put it to your attention that it's 6 times more often that informally employed people are losing their jobs right after they're trying to speak about defending their rights, 6.5 times more. So we have to react to that. Also then involving people in policy implementation and changing public attitude towards paying taxes. What is it talking about? It's about defending or explaining to people how to overcome the negative consequences of paying, like why the taxes need to be paid and what's wrong is with it. But people are mostly interested in something else. They're interested in where their tax money go. They need some guarantees about, like, I'm giving this tax to my government. How exactly am I going to see the impact? Who exactly is going to decide what pension am I going to get? Do I have any? Can I influence at all, like in how these approaches are formulated? Next block is creating economic incentives to formalize employment. We touched on that a little bit, but something that's very obvious, what employees are saying about their employers, is a simplification of registration and licensing, reduction of taxes, well, especially on the salary fund, providing the businesses that create additional jobs some benefits. It might be tax benefits, more flexible tax approaches, or DSCT approach, which is being used in Ukraine. We'll be discussing it a little bit later. Part of the another stimulus would be like the encouraging employers to increase wages and comply with the labor laws. So just making sure that it becomes more profitable than working in the gray area or illegally. So also increasing wages is an example that it's not just we get rid of the barrier, but we also react to something that people say is the main factor for them for choosing informal employment, the higher wages, even if it's an illusion. If we look at the statistics from the big data, because overall we can look at the numbers and we see that informally employed people are get lower wages overall, but sometimes in the conscience of people they can say that they're saving on the taxes, and this is something that's keeping them from legalizing. Also, the spread of social insurance and medical services, medical insurance in particular. So it's very important to improve and spread these benefits. Again, talking about the barriers, because coming and seeing and this, killing the barrier, it's a little bit of a utopian thinking. Next slide, application of people-centered approaches. Actually, there will be 2 slides about that. We have been talking about people-centered justice all the time in all of our recommendations, because those recommendations are built on what people think. However, what's crucial is to improve the administrative procedures for resolving labor disputes. Why is it important? Because the statistics shows that the formal and informally employees, if we talk about the big numbers, the chances are the same and low. They can decide their employment disputes. So basically, officially employed people seem to have more access to those resources, but if we see the results of successful resolution of the disputes, it's the same, which tells us that we need to change the procedures if they do not provide the demand that we can see existing. Online litigation procedures, it's something about using innovation that are available, opportunities that are available to make access to the justice easier, including litigation. There was a question, I'm going to answer it now in the chat, that had to do about, like, how much will it cost for people to go for legal advice, this informal, like to resolve their issues, legal issues. We asked this question as well, but many respondents says, like, we don't have this as a spending article. I'm not going to the lawyer. I'm just basically doing it myself. So I'm not using any procedures, which are very few, which brings into the picture the mediation and negotiation procedures. Creating additional procedures as a response to the fact that more than 80% when facing some legal issues where they're trying to go into personal communication, which actually brings them to threats and like personal conflicts. So this is not something that we are aiming towards, definitely. Next slide, I guess, which talks us about the legal problems that we need to solve. And Yevgen already mentioned that we need to think about here and now, how we change the situation in the context of informal employment. Basically, making sure that people are receiving their sick leaves, prevention of unjustified dismissals, safe working conditions. Another thing that I would also like to mention and stress is that form of discrimination that we didn't really think about, but also a discrimination. Well, discrimination of somebody who is both formally and informally employed in the same company. People mention it quite a lot. Like one job description and somebody is formally employed, another person is doing the same job, is treated quite differently in terms of work conditions, in terms of just general responsibility of the employer. Officially employed people get more benefits. So, and more extra education. So it's another form of hidden discrimination that informally employed persons are facing.
Well, this was one of the founding that is a confirmation for a hypothesis, which is basically a fact. Thank you very much. Well, we have a unique opportunity to speak to most different stakeholders of this sphere in course of our discussion about the policy making. I would ask the first question, address my first question to Maxim and Anna as the representatives of the trade unions. So what is the general role of the trade unions today in terms of the limitation of the informal employment? Well, let's return to the question of who are the informally employed. If we take the period of the past, 30 years ago, so this was an illegal activity, and the person was running the risk of getting in jail if the neighbors find out. Well, today we have a different situation. The Statistics Service of Ukraine say that the informally employed people are, for example, farmers in the countryside. So do we need to make something about them? We don't know, because they are minding their own business, they're paying taxes. Well, what shall we speak about? Shall we speak about the informally employed people like photographs? So is this a single entrepreneur, or is this photograph not a formally registered person, or the gig economy that we are experiencing, which is beyond our classical idea, our classical concept of the legislation. So we are considering how we can fit them, the gig economists, I mean, into our labor relations. So they are behaving somehow strangely, because we cannot find the elements of the labor relations if we speak about the gig economy. So our recommendations, they need to be based on the target audience. So it has already been mentioned by me, these farm enterprises. So this will be they will refer to a different branch of justice, not the labor justice, but the civil justice, for example. Speaking of the self-employed people, we need to find out whether they are registered single entrepreneurs or not. Let's remind ourselves about the fact that these self-employed people have hard times being officially employed, officially registered. Some people who had been officially registered, they need to spend much time like handling with the paperwork. So they don't believe the paperwork they need to tackle with it makes any sense to them. So they don't understand what's next if they're registered. Well, and what about the gig economy? If you follow the age trends, as for the people who are working for the gig economy, for example, if you take the e-scooters and people who work for the e-scooter renting companies, here we see that these are the Z generation representatives, and they are newcomers to the labor market, and they do not understand why they need to at all think about the rules of the labor market. They just want to live freely and live their lives and be flexible. Maybe they will consider their rights and responsibilities later on. So the experts say it is important to organize the representatives of the gig economy. There are some ways to do that, but in practice, we can see that the people from the gig economy are not really organized, and they fail to come up with the kind of trade union. It is more convenient for them to work individually. Well, they just see it fit for them to work unofficially, informally. And we need to understand that the Z generation is not the last generation. They will grow up and the next generation will join the labor market. So we will need to be ready to face it. Well, maybe you can add something in the context of the research that we have presented in terms of the trade unions. Hello, everyone. I represent the Ukrainian Human Rights Helsinki Union, and first and foremost, I would like to thank the Renaissance Foundation and the Legal Development Network for focusing on the people-centered approach to the informal employment. And I can see the link with the research from 2018 by the International Labour Organization. This was a very profound research, but it was based on the institutions. So how institutions shall be improved to identify problems, to improve the functions of the labor inspection, and how the legislation shall be modified. This was a right approach, but it excluded the people. So basically, they came up with the solutions, but they expected that we don't have any doubts about what they are imposing on us. So it is important to focus on the people's needs. And I can see the link to our research because we based on the role of the trade unions. The trade unions been unable to respond to today's challenges. But coming back to the informal employment, so again, we need to consider what we understand under this notion. Coming back to the research of 2018, this was a backbone. We are using it as a basics to understand the informal employment. So what we consider the unofficial employment, and which kind of activities are considered to belong to this group. Without answering this question, it is impossible to formulate any suggestions. I understand that this shall be a dialogue, and we mentioned dialogue today many times. And we need to involve as many stakeholders as possible to come up with some kind of compromise definition that everyone will be happy with, more or less. And another thing, another point I would like to make, I would like to mention the safeguard mechanisms. It has already been mentioned that the today's judiciary system, the administrative instruments, they are not effective enough to ensure that people's needs are met. And people usually don't have too much trust to these instruments. And this research actually confirms that people are not frequently addressing for help, for official help. So we need to raise awareness and clarify things, allowing the judiciary system work more efficiently. So we analyzed the judiciary practice in terms of the trade unions' rights protection. And unless we do that, it is hard to speak about people using the legal instruments. The UNFTP research finding out which instruments people are using. People are not using the instrument of addressing the media. So this instrument is the top instrument as the instrument of influence. And the legal instruments, they are usually somewhere lower on the list, so they're ranking lower. And here we must identify and we must recognize that the trade unions can play the role of the mediators, because the labor rights are not equal. People need to know their rights. So if the employee just addresses the employee has a weaker position compared to the situation when the employee is supported by a trade union. It is easier to resolve certain labor issues, including the issues of informal employment. And this is what I wanted to stress. The research that we have conducted, by doing that, we wanted to see the role of the trade unions. We wanted to recognize the roles as the quasi-human rights organizations. And we have arrived at the conclusion that the trade unions, their role is somehow underestimated in terms of their work against the informal employment. So their cooperation with the NGOs is really important, and their cooperation with the state institutions is important. So we had a case when we cooperated with the National Human Rights Office. They stated that we have the statistics, but on informal employment, but the statistics is just really not representative. So this was just ridiculous, but nevertheless, if we united the NGOs and the trade unions, we would have a stronger position, and we could negotiate with the state institution more successfully. And but least, let me really thank the Legal Development Network for conducting a comprehensive research which involves not only some expert conclusions, but from the insiders, so their opinion is really valuable. Thank you very much, and I will give the microphone to someone else. Yeah, thank you very much, Maxime. So the fact that we keep speaking about this a lot, this is an evidence to the fact that we need to continue the dialogue. But nevertheless, I would like to hear Olena, Alexei, and Georgi. So I have a question to all of you, but please be aware of the timing. So please keep it brief, but still profound in your responses. Olena, so the State Labor Service, this is an institution to like intimidate the employers. And the employees are usually called for addressing your institution. What is the role of your institution in the context of the informal employment? Thank you very much. Yes, lately we are the most horrible institution for all the employers, so nobody can beat us. The thing is that we are the labor inspectors. We are not directly protecting the employees. We are the inspectors, and we care for people following the law. 2014, we faced the fact that there are many unemployed or undeclared employment. So this is an official term, and we are using it internally. So 2014, when we faced this situation, it was clear that we need certain action. And bearing in mind that the research being represented today confirms that the economic element of the undeclared employment is the most important element to the whole situation. So both for the employers and for the employees in some cases. So the amounts that the employee would be supposed to spend for some taxes, it is just included into the salary, and that's it. So the employee gets a bigger salary. So this is why we are imposing fines on the employers. Normally, it is 30 minimum wages for one employee. So this is a big amount. So you can pay taxes for your employees 10 years in a row for the amount of this tax. As for the research of the International Labour Organization. So we are also conducting our own research activities. So we are yearly developing the so-called passport of labor activities, basing on the data of the State Statistics Service, and using our own results. So we are analyzing it not to be able to understand the citizens and to be able to protect them, but to understand where we need to go and where the undeclared, unregistered employment is used most of all, and where we can beat it. To give you an example, last year we started using the market-oriented approach. So we analyzed the certain employers, and then we reacted on the facts. And if we trust the data from the State Statistics Service, in the first quarter of 2021, we had 310,000 less people officially employed compared to the fourth quarter of 2020. But let me comment of this research. Honestly speaking, when I was reading it, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed reading it because it was built differently. And I have seen some things that we did not take into account in our research. And thank you very much for your invitation, and thank you very much for the chance to read the report. I believe that we will use certain elements of your research when we assess the level of the unregistered employment, and in terms of the interaction with other partners and stakeholders.
In April of this month, well, at the end of the last year, we created the task force in order to practical tryout of the mechanisms to lower the level of the undeclared employment. And in April, we approved a document that's called the National Plan of Joint Action. It's on the website. And the task force include the joint body of employers and the trade unions and the state bodies representatives, and also representative of the human rights or the ombudsman of the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament. So with this joint effort, we have developed this document. And one of the points that we focused on is actually educating the young people, the youth, the intolerance or like non-acceptance of unofficial employments. If you know, if you might have heard, there was an international competition about like overcoming the unregistered employment, and so we are moving in the same direction. For that, we employ the social partners from both sides, and we are planning big events for employers in particular. So thank you very much. I think that will be it from me. Thank you, Olena. Two things that were mentioned today that I cannot just ignore: the gig economy and DSCT. I will start with gig economy. So, I would like to ask Georgi, what are the risks of violating of employees' rights in the case of that were mentioned before, the scooters, the delivery, etc. When the employer one-sidedly dismisses the contract and the employee doesn't get anything. Thank you for the question, because for us as providers of free legal assistance is a priority right now, the gig economy. But again, what we are talking about, there are many definitions of gig economy, and Ukraine is the only country that in legislation has gig contracts and gig economy, which is really surprising for international organizations. But anyway, we are the only country that has it officially in the legislation. But anyway, I would like to thank to LDN for mentioning the gig economy in particular and the platform economy. And this phenomenon is, well, Ukraine is number 4 in the world for the numbers of gig employers, which includes the couriers, the delivery guys, the taxi drivers, partially the IT guys, also people who work like the gig platforms, like we have this Kabanchik platform for short gigs. And it's like a huge offshore employment offshore, if I may. So if we look at one of the biggest delivery companies that is actually registered in Spain. They pay their taxes in Spain, but here they're renting their software officially. So they're not paying any taxes, the employee taxes that are actually risking their lives every day because there are like even lethal cases. And this, but again, coming back to what we talk about, whose fault is this? Now coming to the second question, what are we to do? Here we see that COVID came and 30% of people who came to us for assistance were unofficial employees. Starting with the pandemic, it became up to 60%. People didn't even know when they were getting a job, they didn't even know whether they would be official or unofficial employed. They're like, I don't know what are the criteria, you know? So, and that is why this research is really crucially important. So we're trying to use the tools and publics and website to actually increase the awareness and public education. So the question of the resolving this issue is also resolving the question of freedom of association, because our national trade union legislation says that it's organization based on similar interests. So basically you can have a trade union of people who work in the market, you know, sell stuff in the market. I know that in Georgia, there were Uber workers trade union, not official trade union, but still. So it's a question of association. Also, the solidarity networks that are so popular in the West, in Australia, and the States. So like the instruments that are unofficially employed people are using. Again, coming back to the question with gig economy, is adequate reaction from the state, increasing the institutional capacity of workforce. Because Ukraine is under the international obligations to guarantee the proper functioning of the inspection of the workforce and the work conditions. And also it's blocked all the time. So there are roadblocks on the way of that. So it doesn't function the way it should be. So just to let you know that we are on your side. And the question is that we are living in the discourse of the continuous reforming. So our legislation is being continuously reformed. And one of the motives is the deregulation. Let's deregulate everything, employer and employee, free people, etc. Like Georgia is again as an example, they deregulated everything. So everything was deregulated, and in 4 years, the fatalities to the production, they just rise exponentially, like 70-something%, like really high. And gig economy is one of the most dangerous sectors, developing sectors. So gig economy and everything else, we have to say there are 3 whales that we need to build everything upon. Well, it's raising of awareness that then freedom of association, so that people could like organize themselves formally or informally, and actually knock on stakeholders' doors and talk about their opinions. And then number 3 is institutional control. And this cannot happen without proper social dialogue, which is unfortunately a little bit limping in Ukraine. Well, I hope that this is the beginning of the social dialogue in Ukraine. I would ask to pass the mic to Oleksiy. And like we just touched upon the question, like that we need to involve employees into organization of their own defense of their rights. Oleksiy, from what I understand, this DSCT is a tool. Is a tool to de-shadow the business. Can you talk a little bit about DSCT and whether you are planning to develop this tool for basically de-shadow not just business, but also employees? Thank you for your question. Hello, everybody. To start, a short intro about the condition of IT in Ukraine in terms of official employment and unofficial employment. Today, IT is, on one hand, the second biggest export after wheat in Ukraine. Today, IT is the is the only stably developing, so with the 20% growth every year. So it's like a model. On the other hand, is more than 200,000 individual entrepreneurs. So basically, it's the good example of the gig economy. And also, the official employed people, official employees like get not the money that there is registered, like the difference of 3 times. So there are pros and cons for IT. So coming back to what DSCT is, for those people who don't know it, DSCT is a special legal regime for IT and creative industries, which will be voluntarily for the companies, and it will be oriented on scaling of the growth that we currently observe. The competitive adventures are the tax specialties, so like corporate block, the implement of the British rule, no, basically a British legal system a little bit. Basically, also the ownership rights are going to IP, etc. But coming back to what we're talking about. When we were deciding the question, what should be integrated into the city, one of the questions would be, what do we do with all those individual entrepreneurs? So we talked a lot with the stakeholders, and we would tell them, look, looking at basically at the results that we already have and the triggers that trigger the informal employment, we see that the taxation is the main reason. And employers and employees says that their relationships are over-regulated. 2 main things. We ask stakeholders in IT sphere, okay, so what if we do the tax, the 5% tax, will it be okay if we no? We don't like your, legal legislation, you trade labor legislation. We have like, we are private entrepreneurs, it works better, good for us. So if we don't look at the state legislation, so what can we do else? What's wrong about it? It's like not flexible and it's a lot of taxation. But what if you stay private entrepreneurs, PE? So risks and interaction with the tax department, and etc. So basically, none of the 2 forms are perfect. Employment or being an EP in IT. So the solution was, well, our team is really, really like this decision that we came to is like basically a combination of 2. It's like a gig specialist, coming back to gig economy and the challenges that the state has to react to. Of course, it's still on the stage of the experiment, but it's the experiment that has to show that it's basically sustainable and it can compete with everything. So the tax in IT sector is basically one of the top competitive advantages to the way, in order to compete with the giant companies, we need to have it. Like, so if we have the same tax as the other spheres of economy, we'll just basically be killing ourselves, shooting our own leg. So that's why for IT it has to be different. So there are 4 ways of regulating the employment. Standard employment, a personal PE, gig specialist, and just basically a contract with a physical person. The funny thing is that all of the 4 forms has the same taxation, 5%. Benefits are quite clear, but the companies, what should they do to overcome those benefits? So because they're also the things that are blocking the way from the progress, and the things that, well, there are also explanations. We can go, we can also talk about it in the discussion section. Because if you look at the tax reports, then it looks like the IT is not the second. export. So coming back to informal employment, what's a gig contract? If you look at it through the civic law perspective, it's like a special kind of subcontract. And main part of it is everything that goes into the state legislation on employment when it comes to social guarantees. So gig employees get all the social benefits that normal employers get. So minimum vacation of 17 days, sick leave, or the chance to get compensation if they are fired less than 2 weeks notice. So if the company wants to dismiss them earlier, they have to compensate them for the 2 weeks. So, because if you are an individual entrepreneur, it means that your contract can be annulled any moment and not compensate for anything. So if you sum up the topic of discussion and what's offered in the DSCT, this model is competitive and it satisfies the needs of both sides. If you analyze it from the point of view like 164 Convention of Languages, it doesn't match the convention about the trade unions because we're talking about the gig workers. But there are other ways to regulate it. Basically, we're talking about like creating self-governance, which would be better than state governance, so because people know better what is best for them. And this structure will be stakeholder in the policy making and also tools to scale themselves. And what the state gives is bioeconomy, the shadowing of the sphere, and the taxes will definitely not be fewer than what we have now. We hope it will be a good example, good case of how you can reform in a good way. Thank you, Alexei. Really, it sounds like a 5 years plan of like daily work without any days off. Yevgen, a very brief summary. What do we do with all of it next? Thank you, Irina. I got your hint. Of course, the idea was to have the overview of the whole discussion today. We say sorry to our participants, especially those who joined us virtually. I wonder if you can see me. So we delayed quite a bit. So, but there is demand. So of course we will do the very in-depth analysis of everything that was voiced today, was suggested today, and we will hold a more detailed summary and overview of what was suggested and voiced today. Just to wrap it up, I would like to voice one main conclusion. I think everybody will agree with me that overall the understanding that the legal problems of informally employed people and formal employment is a social problem. The possible solution of it is like addressing the original reason, which is usually economic. So it was, somebody said today, there was a suggestion today, quite on the point about the social dialogue without creating a platform. Well, actually many speakers talked about that. So you cannot move forward without this platform. And actually the topics of those focused efforts from the social union, we also already mentioned what Gustavo mentioned, the trust gap overcoming, which is quite a good term. The lack of trust, yes. And the trust gap and how to overcome that, how to overcome the challenges of the new realia, the gig economy, the platform economy. It was a discovery for me that we are number 4 gig economy in the world. It was also mentioned that it's crucial. Well, people-centeredness is something that was mentioned most often, concentrating on the needs of a person, which is also crucial. And Swati also mentioned something that was really important, the cost of non-action, the cost of lack of justice, which is also can be one of the motivating factors for looking for the social dialogue, for looking for the solutions. Next steps, we also mentioned the necessity. Well, when we talk about keeping in mind the interests of all the stakeholders, it's also important to understand what the employers need. If we're really talking about looking for a joint platform where everybody would be interested, and reviewing of the social contract without which nothing will move on. I'm really grateful. I would like to thank everybody, all of our participants, Gustavo, Swati, thank you for your time and sharing your ideas with us and your contribution into our discussion, which was very meaningful indeed. And just a couple commentaries from the audience. Mykola? Thank you. And we're very sorry that we overdid our time. It's hard to underestimate the value of the
research, because the value of the research approach to the state policy reform, this is actually a principle. Well, I am quite intimidated by the approaches where people talk to a sector and that's it. So can I see the analysis of these sector talks? Well, we must trust the research. We must trust the results of the civil society sector work. So this is the first point I would like to make. So we shall not be intimidated by the state policy where the government wants to help people where they don't need any help. So 14% of the citizens just want to remain in the shadow. And here the trade unions arrive and they want to help stop. Well, the civil society is a society of free citizens. Let's be reminded of that. And we need to figure out why they want it and so on and so forth. And secondly, I've been thinking, well, I am renting an apartment, for example. So theoretically, I'm a tax agent of a people I'm paying of a person I'm paying for their service. I'm not sure whether my landlord is paying taxes from what I pay them. And I didn't even ask. But if we come out of the shade, if we get formally employed, what will be the consequence of that? And whether we are going to suffer the consequence, especially in the capital of Ukraine, in Kiev, if the government starts helping this sector actively. I don't know what we are going to have. Well, I am the DIA user, so this digital state system user, and the DIA writes, well, it texts me, well, you tried to register your place of residence, but your attempt failed. So, and I'm making my conclusion. So I'm not asking the government for help, but they are still trying to help me, which intimidates me. Well, so this is my message. You shall ask the people. The people want you to help them and what they think about the modification of the state policy. So this is a very valuable approach that you are demonstrated, as it was already mentioned, not just talking with the sector guys and making like 5% of the tax, why they shall get this 5% and the others not. So do good for everyone, not for a particular sector, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mykola. So what I suggest doing, I suggest starting an informal discussion. So we wanted to make informal employment formal again, but as for our discussion, we need to make our formal discussion informal, which means that we need to let our panelists go. So let's thank everyone who helped us conduct this event, and we will continue working on our issues. Thank you.